Aaron woke 12 hours later and immediately assessed her situation with the cold precision of someone who'd been trained to evaluate threats from the moment consciousness returned. And she noted that she was in a human medical facility that was surprisingly well equipped, that her wounds had been treated competently, and that the human doctor who'd saved her life was sitting in a chair beside her bed looking like he hadn't slept at all. Jiho noticed she was awake and offered her water, which she accepted because her throat felt like she'd been breathing vacuum, even though she knew that wasn't quite what had happened. And she drank slowly while watching him with the kind of attention that made most beings uncomfortable, because Velthara eyes were designed to track prey, and that instinct didn't go away just because you became civilized. She asked him directly what he'd meant about chemical weapons and regenerative medicine and why. He'd talked about those things like they were common knowledge, when every Velthara intelligence briefing said that humans were a young species that had only recently achieved peaceful unification before venturing into space. Jiho tried to deflect, saying he must have been confused or that she'd misheard him through the translation. But Aaron had perfect recall of everything that had happened while she was on that medical table, and she told him so, explaining that Velthara biology included enhanced memory as part of their survival adaptations. And she remembered every single word he'd said. He looked trapped and uncomfortable, and that told her more than any words could have. Because innocent beings didn't look like that when asked simple questions about medical procedures. And she pressed harder, asking why he'd compared her healing rate to human healing rate as if humans had unusually fast regeneration, when that wasn't mentioned in any of the official biological profiles the Coalition had on his species. Jiho stood up and checked her vital signs, clearly trying to buy time to think, and he told her she should rest and recover her strength before worrying about complicated questions. But Aaron had been a military intelligence officer before she became a scout pilot, and she knew evasion when she saw it. She explained to him that her species had been part of the Galactic Coalition for over 8,000 years, and in that time they'd encountered hundreds of other species at various stages of development, and one thing they'd learned was how to read the signs of a civilization's history, in the way its people talked about survival and adaptation and necessity. Humans, according to Coalition records, had achieved space travel only 400 years ago, and had joined the Coalition just 200 years after that, presenting themselves as a species that had overcome its differences through philosophy and mutual understanding, with no major wars in their recent history and no experience with the kinds of weapons that the older species had long since banned. But the way Jiho had talked while treating her wounds didn't match that profile at all, because he'd spoken about biological warfare and genetic adaptation and regenerative medicine with the casual familiarity of someone whose entire species had been shaped by those things, not as abstract concepts but as lived reality that had been passed down through generations. Jiho finally sat back down and looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize as the face of someone caught between competing duties, and he asked her quietly what she planned to do with her suspicions. Aaron considered that question carefully, because it was more complicated than it seemed, and she told him that officially she should report everything to her superiors, who would then investigate and determine whether humanity had violated any Coalition regulations by falsifying their historical records. But unofficially she was curious about why a species would go to such lengths to hide their past. He asked if her curiosity was stronger than her duty, and she admitted she wasn't sure yet, but she wanted to understand what she was dealing with before making any decisions. Because in her experience, the beings who lied about their history usually had very good reasons, either because they were ashamed of what they'd been or because they were afraid of how others would react. The door opened and Hyun entered, bringing with him the stern authority of someone who'd been dealing with bureaucrats all morning, and he told Aaron that the Coalition inspection team would arrive within 48 hours and that she would need to be available for debriefing about what had caused her ship to crash. Aaron acknowledged this with a slight nod and asked Hyun if he knew what his medical officer had revealed during her treatment, and the way Hyun's expression tightened told her that yes, he knew, and no, he wasn't happy about it. Hyun looked at Jiho with disappointment and frustration, and said they would talk later about operational security and the importance of keeping personal knowledge separate from professional duties. Then he left to continue coordinating the station's response to the impending inspection. Aaron and Jiho sat in silence for a while, and she used that time to study him more carefully, noting the scars on his hands that suggested military surgery experience, the way he held himself with the controlled tension of someone who'd seen combat, and the grief in his eyes that spoke of losses that went beyond normal medical failures. She told him she'd been reviewing her ship's logs before the crash and that she'd been pursuing a pirate vessel that had been raiding Coalition supply lines, and the pirates had damaged her engines with a weapon that shouldn't have existed anymore, something that used quantum disruption technology that had been banned 3,000 years ago. Jiho. His expression changed when she mentioned that, and he asked her how pirates could possibly have access to weapons that advanced. And Aaron said that was an excellent question that her superiors had been trying to answer for months, but the working theory was that someone was supplying them with technology from restricted archives. She watched his reaction carefully and saw the moment when he made a connection that troubled him, and she asked what he was thinking. Jiho hesitated again, but then seemed to decide that the truth was less dangerous than speculation, and he told her that if someone had access to restricted archives from 3,000 years ago, then they might also have access to records about species that had been removed from Coalition history, civilizations that had been deemed too dangerous or unstable to be allowed into the modern galactic community. Aaron felt something cold settle in her chest because that possibility had implications she didn't want to consider. And she asked him directly if humanity was one of those removed species, if humans had actually been in space far longer than their official records claimed. Jiho didn't answer with words, but his silence was answer enough, and Aaron found herself recalculating everything she thought she knew about the beings who shared this station with her. She asked how long, and Jiho said more than 800 years. And she asked why they'd hidden it, and he said because the, alternative was being quarantined or destroyed by species that couldn't accept what humanity had been during those early centuries. Aaron demanded to know what humanity had been, and Jiho closed his eyes for a long moment before opening them again and saying they'd been survivors, the kind that did whatever was necessary to keep existing even when that meant becoming monsters. The medical bay felt smaller suddenly, and Aaron realized she was having trouble breathing. Not from her injuries, but from the weight of understanding what she was being told, and she asked if humans had committed genocide. Jiho's voice was quiet and steady when he said yes, twice against 2 other species that humanity had encountered during their early expansion, and both times it had been justified as necessary for human survival, but really it had been fear and aggression, and the absolute certainty that the universe was hostile and only the strong would survive. Aaron had to process that information and reconcile it with the fact that this same species had then somehow transformed itself into the peaceful explorers who'd petitioned to join the coalition. And she asked how that was even possible. Jiho explained that humanity had nearly destroyed itself in a civil war that lasted 50 years, a conflict between those who wanted to continue the path of conquest and those who believed there had to be a better way. And the reformers had won, but the cost had been billions of lives and the complete restructuring of human government and culture. The door opened again, and this time it was Mirai who entered, carrying a datapad and looking worried. And she told them both that she'd found something in the station's historical archives, old transmission records that someone had tried to erase but hadn't quite deleted. Completely, Mirai showed them the data, and Aaron saw references to human colonies that dated back far earlier than the official timeline, along with fragmentary reports about conflicts with species she didn't recognize, and weapon signatures that matched banned technology. Hyun's voice came over the comm again, sounding even more tense than before, and he told Jiho that the coalition inspector had sent ahead a list of questions they wanted answered, and most of those questions were about human medical capabilities and genetic modification programs and historical records of human expansion. Aaron looked at Jiho and saw real fear in his eyes for the first time, and she understood that whatever was about to happen would change everything. Aaron told Kelris that before he made any official reports, he needed to understand the full context of the situation, and she could see his suspicion immediately because coalition inspectors weren't used to being told what they needed to do, especially by someone who was technically under investigation themselves. Kelris said that context didn't matter when regulations had been violated, and he had evidence that humans possessed medical knowledge that exceeded their official development timeline, which suggested either they'd stolen technology from other species or they'd falsified their historical records when joining the coalition. Aaron chose her words carefully and explained that both possibilities were wrong, but the truth was more complicated than simple violation of rules. and she asked him whether the coalition valued accuracy more than convenience, because what she was about to tell him would challenge some fundamental assumptions. The inspector's compound eyes reflected the medical bay lights in strange patterns, and he said the coalition was built on accurate information, and any species that provided false data was subject to sanctions up to and including expulsion or quarantine. So if Aaron had evidence of human dishonesty, she was required to share it immediately. She asked him a different question instead. Had he ever wondered why the coalition's founding species all seemed to have such similar histories of peaceful development and philosophical enlightenment, when basic probability suggested that intelligent life should emerge in many different forms with many different paths to civilization? Kelrus said that was irrelevant speculation and he wanted facts, not philosophy. But Aaron could see she'd planted a seed of doubt because he was intelligent enough to recognize a valid question. Even when he didn't want to consider its implications, Aaron explained that during her treatment, Jiho had made comments that revealed knowledge about biological warfare and genetic adaptation that humans shouldn't possess according to their official timeline, and yes, this suggested their history was incomplete or inaccurate. But before Kelrus reported that he should ask himself why a species would hide such information, the inspector said the reason didn't matter, because deception was deception regardless of motivation, and the coalition had to be able to trust that member species were honest about their capabilities and history. Aaron agreed in principle but pointed out that the coalition's rules assumed all species had equal opportunity to develop peacefully, when in fact some species face circumstances that force them to make terrible choices just to survive, and perhaps humanity's hidden history reflected those kinds of choices. Kelrus was losing patience, and he told Aaron directly that if she was defending human deception, she was violating her own oath as a coalition military officer, and he would have no choice but to include her in his investigation and report. Before Aaron could respond, Mirai burst into the medical bay carrying her datapad and looking frightened, and she told them that she'd found something else in the station's archives, encrypted files that shouldn't have been accessible, but she'd managed to crack the security. Kelrus immediately demanded to see whatever Mirai had found, and she hesitated, looking at Aaron and then at Jiho, who had just entered behind her, and the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Mirai showed them the files, and Aaron felt her world tilt, because what she was seeing were coalition records, official documents that dated back thousands of years, and they detailed something called the cleansing protocols, which had been used by the founding species to eliminate civilizations deemed too dangerous or unstable to join the galactic community. The records listed 12 species that had been destroyed, not through war but through systematic isolation and resource denial until they collapsed, and each case included justifications about protecting the greater good and preventing potential threats before they could fully develop. Kelrus tried to grab the datapad, but Mirai pulled it back and said she'd already sent copies to secure locations throughout the station, and if anything happened to her or the others, the files would automatically be broadcast on all frequencies. The inspector's entire body language changed, and he told Mirai that she'd just committed a serious crime by accessing classified coalition materials, and he would have her detained immediately for violating security protocols. Aaron stepped between them and said that Kelrus needed to think very carefully about his next actions, because if those files were authentic, then the coalition had built its entire moral authority on a foundation of hidden genocides, and exposing humanity's past while hiding the coalition's own crimes would be hypocrisy of the highest order. Kelrus said the situations weren't comparable because the cleansing protocols had been necessary to protect developing civilizations from aggressive species, while humanity had committed violence out of fear and expansionism. Jiho spoke for the first time, and his voice was cold when he said that every genocide in history had been justified by its perpetrators as necessary, and the fact that the coalition had institutionalized the practice just made it worse, not better. The argument was interrupted by Hyun's voice over the comm system, announcing that a coalition military vessel had just entered the system and was demanding permission to dock, and from his tone it was clear this wasn't a routine visit. Kelrus looked satisfied and said he'd called for backup as soon as he'd found the anomalies in the medical records, and now proper authorities would handle the situation, including detaining all the humans for questioning. Aaron made a decision that went against every regulation she'd ever followed. and she told Kelris that she couldn't allow him to report any of this until they'd established what the truth actually was. Not just about humanity, but about the coalition itself. The inspector said she was committing treason and her career was over. But Aaron pointed out that her career had been over the moment she'd started asking questions that threatened the established narrative. And at this point, she cared more about finding out what was real than protecting her position. Mireille suggested they contact the incoming military vessel directly and present all the evidence they had, both about humanity's hidden history and about the coalition's cleansing protocols, and let whoever commanded that ship decide what to do with the information. Yun said that was incredibly risky because they had no way of knowing whether the ship's commander would be sympathetic or would simply carry out orders to silence everyone who knew too much. Jiho pointed out that they were out of good options and the only choice left was between hiding the truth and hoping for the best or revealing everything and forcing the issue into the open, where it couldn't be quietly buried. Aaron accessed the station's communication system using her military codes and opened a channel to the incoming vessel. And she was surprised to hear a familiar voice respond because the ship was commanded by Admiral Kieran, who had been her mentor and commanding officer before she'd transferred to Scout Operations. Kieran's voice was stern when he asked Aaron to explain why she was interfering with a coalition inspection and why Inspector Kelris had reported that she was defending human violations of membership protocols. Aaron took a deep breath and told Kieran that she needed him to review certain files before making any decisions about how to proceed, and she transmitted copies of both the human historical records that Jiho had shared and the coalition cleansing protocol documents that Mireille had uncovered. There was a long silence, and Aaron could imagine Kieran reviewing the information with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and she knew he would understand the implications immediately because he was one of the most intelligent beings she'd ever known. When Kieran spoke again, his voice had changed, and he asked Aaron if she was certain the documents were authentic, and she said she'd verified the human records through multiple sources, and the coalition files had encryption signatures that matched official archives. Kieran said he needed to think about this, and he would be docking in 30 minutes, and until then everyone was to remain exactly where they were and not communicate with anyone. Outside the station, Kelris protested that the Admiral was exceeding his authority and should simply follow protocol by detaining the suspects and securing the evidence. But Kieran cut him off and said that protocol assumed they were dealing with a simple violation rather than a systemic problem that might require fundamental reevaluation of coalition principles. After the channel closed, Aaron sat down because her injuries were catching up with her, and she felt exhausted not just physically but emotionally from the weight of everything she'd learned. Jiho came over and checked her vital signs, his doctor instincts overriding the political crisis, and he told her quietly that regardless of what happened next, he appreciated what she was trying to do. Aaron said she wasn't sure she was trying to help humanity specifically, but rather trying to force honesty into a system that had been built on selective truth. And maybe that would benefit everyone, or maybe it would cause chaos, but at least it would be genuine. Mireille was still working on her data pad, and she suddenly made a sound of distress, and when the others asked what was wrong, she showed them another file she'd found, this one from Earth's diplomatic corps. The file contained instructions for what human officials should do if their Admiral Kieran's decision to call for a special coalition council session set off reactions across the entire galaxy, because word spread quickly that something unprecedented was happening, and within hours every major species had dispatched representatives, while smaller civilizations waited anxiously to learn what crisis could possibly require such urgent attention. The station became the center of galactic focus, and Hyun found himself coordinating the arrival of dozens of ships while trying to maintain normal operations. And Mireille worked constantly to prepare data presentations that would show all the evidence they'd gathered in the clearest possible format. Jiho spent his time caring for Aaron, whose injuries still required monitoring, and they talked about what was coming and whether the galaxy was ready for the truth they were about to reveal. Aaron said her species had a saying that translated roughly to sunlight kills infection, meaning that exposing problems was the first step toward healing them, and she believed the coalition needed this exposure, even if the process would be painful. Kelris remained confined to quarters under Kieran's authority, and he'd stopped protesting once he realized the Admiral was serious about forcing a confrontation, but everyone knew he would report everything to his superiors, and there would be political consequences regardless of how the council session went. 3 days after Kieran's announcement, the council convened in a hastily prepared chamber aboard a neutral diplomatic vessel that had been equipped with translation systems for all the attending species, and representatives from 47 civilizations filled the space with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Kieran opened the session by explaining that evidence had emerged suggesting fundamental dishonesty in how certain species, including humanity, had presented their histories, but also evidence that the coalition itself had engaged in practices that contradicted its stated principles. The chamber erupted in protests and demands for clarification, and it took several minutes for order to be restored before Kieran could continue. He presented the human records first, showing the timeline of Earth's actual space expansion and the evidence of genocides committed during the early period, and the reaction was immediate, with many species calling for humanity's expulsion and others demanding military action to contain what they saw as a threat. The human delegation tried to defend themselves by explaining the context of survival and fear, but their arguments fell flat because genocide couldn't be justified regardless of circumstances, and Jiho watched from the observers section as everything he'd feared began to unfold. Then Kieran presented the second set of evidence: the Coalition's cleansing protocols and the records of 12 civilizations that had been systematically destroyed by the founding species under the justification of protecting galactic stability. The chamber fell silent as representatives processed what they were seeing, and then the silence broke into chaos that was even worse than before, because these weren't accusations against a single species, but against the entire foundation of Coalition governance. One of the elder species representatives tried to dismiss the cleansing protocols as necessary actions taken during a different era when the rules of civilization weren't yet established, but Aaron stood and challenged this by pointing out that the last cleansing had occurred only 3,000 years ago. Well, after the Coalition had been founded on principles of peaceful coexistence, another representative argued that comparing humanity's crimes to the Coalition's protective measures was false equivalence, because the cleansings had been carried out to prevent greater harm. But Jiho was given permission to speak, and he said that was exactly how humanity had justified their genocides, by claiming they were preventing future threats. The debate raged for hours with no clear resolution emerging, and it became obvious that the galaxy was dividing into factions: those who believed humanity should be punished for deception, those who thought the Coalition's hypocrisy was the greater crime, and those who wanted to find some middle path that addressed both issues. Miri had prepared a third presentation that she'd been holding back, and she requested permission to show it now because she believed it was relevant to the discussion. What she revealed was a comprehensive analysis of every species in the Coalition and their historical records, and she'd found gaps and inconsistencies in almost every civilization's official timeline, suggesting that humanity wasn't unique in having hidden parts of their past. Some species had covered up wars of conquest. Others had erased evidence of environmental disasters they'd caused through negligence, and several had simply omitted periods of internal conflict that didn't fit their preferred narrative of steady, peaceful progress. The implications were staggering, because if every species had engaged in some level of historical revision, then the entire Coalition was built on mutual comfortable lies rather than honest acknowledgement of universal flaws. Representatives stood and said this was irrelevant distraction from the specific crime of human genocide, but another countered that it showed humanity's real crime was being caught, rather than being uniquely evil. Kieran called for order and proposed something radical. Instead of punishing humanity specifically, the Coalition should institute a new policy of historical transparency, where all species were required to acknowledge their full past, including the parts they weren't proud of. The proposal sparked intense debate because many species didn't want to expose their own secrets, but others recognized that continuing the pattern of selective truth would only create more problems in the future. Aaron requested permission to speak, and she shared her own species' hidden history of violence and conquest, explaining that the Velthera had committed atrocities 8,000 years ago, but had been allowed to forget them because they'd had time for the galaxy to move on. She argued that humanity's real crime wasn't being worse than other species, but being younger and therefore having less time for their mistakes to fade into comfortable distance. And perhaps the solution wasn't to punish them for honesty, but to create a framework where all species could acknowledge their pasts without fear of destruction. Representative from a small species that had only recently joined the coalition stood and said they appreciated this discussion because they'd been terrified their own hidden history would be discovered and used against them, and knowing that even the elder species had dark pasts made them feel less alone. That comment seemed to shift something in the chamber, and more representatives began sharing their own species' secrets, creating a cascade of confession that was painful, but also strangely liberating. Kelrus tried to interrupt and argue that this was all undermining the authority and stability of the coalition. But Kieran said that authority built on lies wasn't worth maintaining, and stability that required ignorance wasn't true peace. The session continued for 3 more days with breaks for rest and consultation, and gradually a consensus began to emerge. The coalition would not expel humanity, but would place them under probationary status while implementing new transparency requirements for all member species. Additionally, the cleansing protocols would be formally abolished, and a historical reconciliation commission would be established to investigate and acknowledge all past atrocities committed by coalition members. It wasn't a perfect solution, and many species remained angry or frightened by the revelations, but it was a start toward building something more honest than what had existed before. When the final vote came, the measure passed with significant majority support, and humanity remained part of the coalition, though their relationship with other species would be complicated for years to come. Jiho felt strange relief when he heard the results because he'd expected much worse, and he realized that sometimes the bravest thing a civilization could do was admit its flaws and ask others to judge them honestly. Erin found him after the session ended, and she told him she was resigning from military service to join the new Reconciliation Commission, and she asked if he would consider doing the same, because they needed beings who understood both the importance of truth and the complexity of forgiveness. Jiho said he'd spent 15 years trying to hide from his species' past, and maybe it was time to spend the next 15 helping to acknowledge it, so he agreed to join her. Yun was promoted to regional coordinator for human-alien cooperation programs, and Cheonan 7 became a symbol of the kind of honest dialogue that the new coalition wanted to encourage. Mirai became the youngest member of the Galactic Transparency Initiative, and she spent her time helping species uncover and share their hidden histories. 6 months later, Jiho was treating a minor injury Erin had sustained during a diplomatic mission that had gotten more physical than expected, and as he worked, he found himself talking through the procedure the way he always did. Erin smiled and reminded him that his casual comments about human medical knowledge were what had started this entire cascade of revelations, and she asked if he regretted being so careless with his words. Jiho said he'd spent a long time thinking about that, and he'd realized his subconscious had wanted the truth to come out, that carrying the weight of hidden history had been exhausting, and some part of him had been. The auction house floated in the darkness of space like a massive jewel orbiting the neutral moon of Threshold Prime, and inside its walls, the galaxy's most dangerous beings were bought and sold like cattle, while outside the stars watched in silence and judged nothing because the universe cared little for morality or justice or the screams of those who suffered in chains. Jiwon stood at the back of the auction hall with his arms crossed over his chest, and his scarred face showed no emotion as he watched the proceedings with cold calculation, because he had seen worse things in his life than slave auctions, and his cybernetic left arm hummed quietly with power as servos adjusted to maintain perfect stillness, while around him representatives from a dozen empires whispered and schemed and placed their bids on warriors and killers and exotic creatures that would die for their entertainment. The human mercenary captain wore an old Earth military jacket that had seen better days, and the fabric was torn in places where plasma burns had nearly killed him years ago, but he kept it anyway because it reminded him of who he was and where he came from, and why he fought in this cold galaxy that seemed determined to grind humanity into dust beneath the boots of ancient empires that viewed Earth as nothing more than an upstart world full of violent primitives. Daehyun stood beside his captain and shifted nervously from foot to foot because he knew that look in Jiwon's eyes, and it meant trouble was coming like a storm on the horizon. and the tactical genius had followed his captain through 3 sectors and countless battles, but he still questioned the man's sanity on a regular basis because Jiwan had a habit of doing things that should get them all killed but somehow never did. The auctioneer was a tall insectoid creature with too many legs and a voice that clicked and buzzed through translation devices as it gestured with thin appendages toward the stage where the next lot was being prepared, and the crowd leaned forward with interest because rumors had spread through the station about what was coming next, and even hardened criminals and military officers felt their pulse quicken with anticipation and fear. The lights dimmed and quantum restraints hummed with power as they brought her onto the stage, and the crowd gasped because Princess Hana was everything the rumors promised, and more, with her crimson skin gleaming under the harsh lights and her 4 arms bound in glowing chains that suppressed the berserker rage that had made her legendary across known space, while her amber eyes swept across the assembled buyers with hatred so pure it seemed to burn the air itself. The auctioneer's voice filled the hall with practiced enthusiasm as it explained that this was the last surviving member of the Valreth royal family, and her people had been wiped out 5 years ago by the Chromath Empire in a genocide that shocked even the most callous observers. But what made her valuable was not her royal blood but her skill in battle, because before her capture, she had destroyed 3 Chromath battlecruisers single-handedly and killed over 2,000 soldiers in her quest for vengeance. Hana stood on the platform with her head held high despite the chains, and her eyes promised death to anyone who dared claim ownership over her, because she was a princess of a dead world and a warrior without equal, and she would rather die than serve another master. But the restraints held her power in check and reduced her to nothing more than property to be sold to the highest bidder. The auctioneer started the bidding at 1 million galactic credits and expected a frenzy of competition because warriors of her caliber were rare and valuable. But instead the hall fell into uncomfortable silence as buyers looked at each other and shook their heads, because everyone knew the stories of what happened to those who tried to control a Valreth berserker, and none of them wanted to die screaming in the night when she inevitably broke free from whatever restraints they placed on her. Minutes passed in awkward quiet while the auctioneer tried to encourage bids with increasingly desperate promises about the security measures that came with the purchase and the guaranteed loyalty programs and the insurance policies, but still no one raised their hand because Princess Hana was too dangerous and too angry, and too likely to paint the walls with their blood the moment she got the chance. The auctioneer was about to withdraw her from sale when a calm voice cut through the silence from the back of the hall and said, 10 million credits without hesitation or fear. And the crowd turned, as one to see who was insane enough to make such a bid. Jiwan walked forward through the parting crowd with steady steps, and his boots echoed on the metal floor, while his scarred face remained expressionless and his cybernetic arm caught the light. As he moved, and whispers spread through the assembled buyers like wildfire, because everyone recognized the patch on his jacket that marked him as human. And humans had only been part of the galactic community for a few decades, but they had already earned a reputation for being absolutely insane. The auctioneer seemed surprised but quickly recovered and asked if the bid was serious, because 10 million credits was an enormous sum for a single slave, no matter how skilled, and Jiwan simply nodded once and transferred the funds from his account without saying another word, while Daehyun behind him muttered a prayer to gods he didn't believe in because his captain had finally lost his mind. Completely, Hana's eyes locked onto Jiwan as he approached the stage, and she searched his face for the fear she expected to see, but found only something else that she couldn't quite identify, because this human looked at her, not as property or a weapon or a trophy, but as something different, and it confused her enough that her rage flickered for just a moment, before returning with renewed intensity. The transaction completed quickly because the auction house wanted the dangerous princess off their station as soon as possible, and within minutes Jiwan held the control device for her restraints, while guards watched nervously from a safe distance and advised him to keep her sedated during transport because Valreth berserkers had been known to break free even from quantum chains when their rage reached its peak. Jiwan ignored their advice and simply gestured for Hana to follow him toward the docking bay, where his ship waited, and she walked behind him with murder in her eyes and 4 hands clenched into fists that ached to crush his skull. But the restraints held her power in check and reduced her to nothing more than a prisoner, following her new owner to whatever fate awaited her. Daehyun caught up with them in the corridor away from the crowd and grabbed Jiwan's arm with barely contained panic in his voice and said, "Captain, this is the craziest thing you have ever done, and that is saying something. Considering you once tried to ram a battlecruiser with our cargo hauler." But Jiwon just smiled that sad, knowing smile he wore when he remembered things from his past. The human captain looked back at Princess Hana, who glared at him with enough hatred to melt steel, and he said quietly, "So only Daehyun could hear that no one deserves to be in chains, and especially not a princess seeking justice for her murdered people." And Daehyun realized in that moment that his captain saw something of himself in this dangerous alien warrior, and that was either going to save them all or get them killed horribly. They reached the docking bay where the Indomitable waited like a scarred veteran of 1,000 battles, and the ship was a retrofitted Earth destroyer that combined human stubbornness with salvaged alien technology in ways that horrified proper engineers, but somehow kept flying through sheer determination. And the crew watched through viewports as their captain approached with the most dangerous purchase he had ever made. Hana looked up at the ship and saw the name painted in both human script and Galactic standard, and something about that word resonated with her because she too had been indomitable once before the Chromath came and destroyed everything she loved and left her alone in a galaxy that saw her only as a monster to be feared or a weapon to be controlled. Jiwon paused at the boarding ramp and turned to face her, and for the first time since the auction, he spoke directly to her and said, "I know what they took from you, and I know the rage that burns in your chest, because I have felt it too, and I am not your owner because humans do not own other beings, but if you want revenge against those who destroyed your world, then I can help you find it." Princess Hana stared at this strange, scarred human who had paid a fortune for her freedom rather than her service, and she did not know whether to believe him or kill him the moment her restraints came off. But something in his eyes told her that he understood loss in a way that few beings could, and that perhaps this human was just as broken as she was, and maybe that meant something in this cold, uncaring galaxy. The ship hummed with power as it jumped into hyperspace and left Threshold Prime behind, while Princess Hana sat in the cargo hold surrounded by armed guards who kept their weapons trained on her, even though she remained bound in quantum restraints that glowed with suppressed energy. And her amber eyes tracked every movement around her like a predator, calculating which prey to kill first when the chains finally broke. Jiwon stood in the doorway of the cargo hold and watched his crew watch, the prisoner with fear written plainly on their faces because they had heard the stories about Valrith berserkers who could tear through reinforced hull plating with their bare hands and crush skulls like overripe fruit when their rage consumed them, and none of them understood why their captain had spent 10 million credits on something that would probably kill them all in their sleep. The captain of the Indomitable had not slept since the auction because he was thinking about the decision he made and whether it was the right choice or just another mistake in a long line of mistakes that defined his life since the war, that took everything from him and left him wandering the galaxy looking for purpose in the bottom of bottles. And the barrels of guns. Daehyun found his captain in the observation deck, staring out at the swirling colors of hyperspace with that distant look that meant he was remembering things best left forgotten. And the tactical officer sat down beside Jiwon without asking permission because they had been through too much together to stand on ceremony. And he said, "Captain, we need to talk about what happens when we release her from those restraints." Jiwon turned to look at his oldest friend and said, "We release her the moment we drop out of hyperspace near Haven Station, because I meant what I said about humans not owning other beings." And Daehyun laughed without humor and said, "That is noble and stupid in equal measure because she will kill us all the second those chains come off." But Jiwon just shook his head slowly. The human captain explained that he had done research on the Valreth during the flight and learned that they were a warrior culture built on honor and personal combat, and they respected strength but also mercy, and he gambled everything on the hope that Princess Hana would see his gesture of freeing her as an act of respect rather than weakness. And Daehyun muttered that was one hell of a gamble to make with all their lives below decks in the medical bay. Mirai was preparing sedatives and trauma supplies because she knew what was coming, even if the captain pretended otherwise, and the young medic had empathic abilities that let her feel the emotions of those around her like waves crashing against rocks, and right now she felt the princess burning with rage so intense it made her head ache. Just being on the same ship, Sun Hee worked in the engine room surrounded by the controlled chaos of human engineering where nothing was built to specifications because specifications were just suggestions. and duct tape held together systems that should require precision manufacturing. And the eccentric engineer talked to the ship like it was alive, because in her mind it was, and she told the Indomitable to be ready for trouble, because the captain was doing something crazy again. The ship dropped out of hyperspace near Haven Station, which was a neutral trading post built into a hollowed-out asteroid where smugglers and pirates and mercenaries came to do business away from the law, and Jiwon ordered everyone except Daehyun to stay clear of the cargo hold, because what happened next would determine if his gamble paid off or if they all died screaming. Princess Hana felt the ship stop moving and knew something was about to change because her warrior instincts had kept her alive through 5 years of hunting Chromath soldiers across hostile territory, and those same instincts now screamed that this moment was important and would define everything that came after. Jiwon walked into the cargo hold carrying the control device for her restraints, and the guards raised their weapons nervously, but he waved them away and ordered them to leave because he wanted no witnesses to what happened next. And Daehyun stood by the door with his hand on his sidearm, ready to shoot if things went wrong. The human captain approached the princess slowly with his hands visible and empty, except for the control device, and he said, "I am going to release your restraints now because I believe you deserve freedom more than captivity, and if you want to kill me after that, then I will not stop you, because I have lived long enough to know that some debts can only be paid in blood." Hana stared at him with suspicion because no one in the galaxy did things without expecting something in return, and she asked what he wanted from her if not servitude. And Jiwon smiled that sad smile again, and said nothing except perhaps understanding between two warriors who know what it means to lose everything. The quantum restraints deactivated with a sound like breaking glass, and Princess Hana felt her power return in a rush that made her arms tremble with barely contained energy, and the berserker rage that had been suppressed for weeks exploded through her body like liquid fire through her veins, and she moved before conscious thought could stop her. Her attack was blindingly fast, as 4 fists drove toward the human who had freed her because rage demanded blood and pain, demanded answers. And her warrior culture taught that strength was the only language worth speaking in a universe built on violence. But Jiwon did not fight back, and that confused her enough to slow her strikes. The captain of the Indomitable dodged and blocked and took hits that cracked ribs and split skin, but he never once raised his hands to strike her in return, and his eyes held no fear. Only sad understanding as he absorbed her fury and let it wash over him like a storm that eventually had to pass. Blood ran down Jiwon's face from a cut above his eye, and his breathing came in ragged gasps from damaged ribs. But still he did not fight back, and he said between impacts that he knew what it was like to lose everything and to want the galaxy to burn for what they took from you. And he said he had walked that same path of rage and found only emptiness at its end. Princess Hana hesitated, with one fist raised to crush his skull because something in his voice reached through the red haze of her berserker rage and touched the part of her that was still rational and still capable of seeing beyond immediate violence, and she demanded to know what right he had to speak of loss when her entire species had been erased from existence. Jiwon straightened despite his injuries and told her about the war between humans and the Korvax Alliance when he was just a young soldier full of ideals, and how his entire platoon had been massacred in an ambush, and he alone survived by hiding under the bodies of his friends while the enemy celebrated their victory above him, and how he spent 10 years hunting down every officer responsible until the rage finally burned itself out and left him hollow. The princess lowered her fist slowly because she recognized that same emptiness in his eyes that she saw in her own reflection, and she asked what stopped him from continuing his revenge. And Jiwon said simply that killing everyone responsible did not bring back the dead, and revenge was a meal that never filled the hunger inside. Mirai chose that moment to rush into the cargo hold, despite orders to stay away because her empathic senses felt the shift in emotion from burning rage to confused pain. And she projected calm with her abilities while approaching the princess carefully and offering medical attention for injuries sustained during captivity. Princess Hana collapsed against the wall, suddenly exhausted because maintaining berserker rage required enormous energy, and she had not eaten properly in weeks, and the emotional confrontation with Jiwon had drained her reserves, and she let the human medic approach with bandages and supplies while watching her carefully for signs of deception. The days that followed were strange for everyone aboard the Indomitable, because they had a Valreth warrior princess living among them who could kill them all without effort, but who seemed content to observe rather than attack, and Hana spent her time watching how the crew interacted with quiet fascination. She noticed how Jiwon treated his people not as subordinates, but as equals, and how he asked for opinions rather than giving orders, and how humans seemed to argue constantly about everything but still work together with surprising efficiency. And she realized this was completely different from her own culture, where hierarchy was absolute and questioning. Leadership meant death. Sunhee approached the princess nervously one day and asked if she wanted to see the engine room because humans loved showing off their technology, and Hana agreed out of curiosity and found herself listening to the engineer explain impossible things about human vessels that should not work, but somehow did through sheer stubborn refusal to accept the laws of physics. The eccentric engineer talked about how humans had only been in space for a few centuries and had to reverse engineer alien technology. They barely understood and combine it with their own primitive systems in ways that made proper scientists weep, but which worked anyway, and Hana found herself almost smiling at the enthusiasm. Jiwon found her in the observation deck late one night when she could not sleep, because nightmares of her world burning still haunted her dreams, and he sat beside her without speaking for a long time, before saying that humans believed tomorrow could be better than today even when logic said otherwise, and that faith in impossible things was what made his people dangerous.